Hello and welcome. In this video I'm going to show you the order of construction for this blouse. So get your fabric, pattern pieces and sewing machine ready and let's stitch this blouse together. By the way, did you know that as well as pattern cutting, I very often include order of construction in my video lessons. So if that's something you always want a little bit of support with and you find interesting, do have a look at the description on how you can learn with me. Before I show you how to stitch everything together, let's quickly talk about the last thing you're going to do, which is finishing the seams on the inside. The easiest way, because this is a 3D construction with the gusset, is to finish each piece separately before you stitch it together, so you can overlock all your seam allowances on your gusset, your sleeve and your bodice pieces, and also of course on your strap and neckline pieces. That way it'd be really straightforward to construct, because we're going into sort of quite a few construction bits where 3 pieces meet. So if you want a really easy life, zigzag or overlock everything before you start constructing. If you want a different method, I'm going to show you that right at the end. The first thing you need to do is to prepare your sleeve and your bodice pieces. Both have a gathering line and we need to create that. You can see I'm using an old embroidered curtain, so I've got slightly wavy edges, but it will work the same otherwise. So what I'm going to do along the edges, which are indicated as gathers on my pattern piece, I'm going to run a really long, what I call a gathering stitch on my sewing machine, which is basically just stitching at 1 centimeter where my stitching line is on the longest stitch setting, and that will give me a very loose stitch which I can easily pull to create lots of gathers. You can do 1 line of stitching or you can do several parallel ones. Several parallel ones are good because they will give you a really controlled area to gather. You can see when you stitch it, the sleeve already gathers, so I'm going to just knot it on one end and then start pulling one of the threads on the other side. For the sleeve you need to have the gathers to fit your strap panel, plus of course your front neck panel and your back neck panel. So the easiest way is to find your notch on here and then do one side the right length like this, and then move it over here and to the other side. Alternative, of course, you can just measure the overall length and then do it. Once you're happy, knot it on this side as well. I'm going to now do the same for my other sleeve, and I'm also going to do the same for both my bodice panels, but of course line them up to my neckline panel. Once you've gathered all your sleeves and bodices, it's time to construct the neckline to put them on. You need all your neckline pieces and all your strap pieces. I'm going to construct the neck panel in 2 stages. First of all, I'm going to stitch my pair of outer straps to the facing on one side. You can see I've used the lace for the outer and flat line or mounted it on a piece of the plain section, and then I've also got some plain for my facing. So first of all I need to stitch them together, so I need to decide where I want this. I want this on the inside, I think, so I'm going to lay my lining on top. I can pin it together and then literally just stitch it end to end. I'm going to do exactly the same on this. This I'm going to do, I think, like that. Again, just stitch one side end to end. You can see where I flat lined mine or mounted it. It puckered a little bit, and that's because this is super fine, quite brittle cotton, so it's a little bit of a challenge to work with. I'm quite glad I did this first because it showed me it's a tricky fabric. But all I can do this thankfully in the seam allowance. So when I'm now stitching on my actual stitch line, I'm going to use a really small stitch, and that will help me control it. So stitch along here and give it a good press. Next, I need to understitch the straps. So what that means is turning all the seam allowance into my facing side, so the side which won't be on show, and then I'm adding a stitch line 2 mil away from my original seam line, and that's going to hold everything in place. Once I've done that, I'm going to actually iron it over like that, and it will give me a really nice flat edge, and so slightly pull the outer over, which means it gives you a really nice neat outer. Here you can see 2 nice neat straps. Now I need to insert them into my neckline. So I've got a front and a back, but they're of course reversible. So it's going to end up looking like this. All I need to do is turn this over, and it's always worth doing it in one go, just to make sure you get all your seam allowances on the same side. And trust me, I've done it so often. It's normally when you're rushing things and you're doing it on the sewing machine, and you always end up this one seam in a garment the wrong way around. But that's of course beauty of sewing. You can easily unpick it in most cases. Okay, I'm just lining everything up. Of course you can add more pins, I'm just using them to help me guide it. So you can either stitch one side first, or the other option is to sandwich your straps between the inner and the outer straight away. So if you're working with quite an easy fabric, you can stitch all of this in one seam. So pin it again, and then stitch along here, and then stitch along here. Next, give everything a good press, and then once you've pressed it open, again add some understitching. So press the seam allowances all into the facing, and then add a line of understitching 2 mil away from our original seam, so top stitching into the facing. Do it on both sides, and then iron it together. That's your neckline done. Now it's time to attach your gathered panels. With this method, you're going to get a really nice finish on the bodice side. On the sleeve sides, we're going to just overlock or bind the inside. You could do it really complicated and get a really neat edge everywhere. If you want to do that, you will have to create a outer neck panel first, so don't attach it to the facing at all. Then you can insert all the gathered panels, and then afterwards you can attach the completed inner, and that way you can actually turn the seam allowances on all your facings over and then stitch everything in the stitch. But it's a lot more complicated because you have to stop stitching exactly the stitch line and stuff. So this one is actually, you can see it's really easy. It just builds up and there's no tricky stitching at all. It's just straight lines. So I'm going to go with that. It just means it's slightly less beautiful at the sleeve edge, but that's a compromise I'm willing to take. So what we're going to do is put the bodices in, and they will have a really nice finish on the inside. So I'm going to choose one of my bodices and line it up and attach it to my outer only. And I always like to stitch the gathered side up. I also don't want any gathers in the seam allowance, so I'm moving my gathers slightly away. So my seam allowance and the first sort of half a centimeter after that roughly is flat. I forgot to put my notch on my neck panel, which is a little bit naughty. Now I can line my center front or center backs up. Because the great thing about this style is it's reversible. So if you're using something like this, so the embroidery is different on every panel, you can actually have 2 blouses for the price of 1. And interestingly, it's not slightly too big. But the great thing is I can just make it slightly tighter until it's the right size, and then I will stitch it together, and I do the same on the other side. You have 2 options for finishing your bodice panels on the inside. The first one is neater. I talked about it a little bit a minute ago, and it is to iron over all your seam allowances into your neck panel. Then on your facing, iron over about 3/4 of your seam allowance, which will make this panel a little bit longer. Then we pin it together, and I pin it normally first on this side, so it's slightly bigger, and then you can turn it over, and then you stitch on this side, and you stitch on exactly your same stitch line as before, which is like the little ditch which is formed by the 2 fabric pieces joining. So you stitch literally in this sort of ditch trench, and that will make the stitch line impossible and give you a really nice finish on the inside. On the other hand, to make your life a lot easier, you can just stitch all of these together and then overlock your edges and or bind them. That'd be much faster. I've used the stitch in the ditch method, and I'll show you quickly how it looks like. You can see on the inside it looks really nice and smoothly finished with a top stitched line, and you can see one side I did perfectly, on one side I had a little loop, but it's so close to the seam allowance I'm just going to ignore it. If you want to get it perfect, all you need to do is basically pull it down slightly, make sure it actually overlaps, pin it in, and then restitch it. The next thing to do is put in the sleeves. The sleeves need to be fixed to both layers of our neck and strap. Of course, here this is my stitch line, not the edge of my seam allowance, so I'm going to line up what would be my stitch line on the sleeve. So I basically have the sleeve bit overlapping by my seam allowance. Just make sure you do that, because otherwise your sleeve will be too short, because of course the bodice and neck panel have already been stitched together. So if I show you, basically that's my seam line, and then this is my excess on the sleeve, to make sure when I put everything together it fits. Then just make sure you've got all 3 layers together, pin them in a few places, and then stitch from stitch line to stitch line. So you're not stitching to the end of your sleeve fabric piece, you're only stitching to what would be the stitch line on your pattern, which is the seam between your bodice and your neck. Do it on both sleeves. The next thing we need to put in is our gusset. There are two ways of attaching your gusset. The first one is to stitch your side seams together to the notch where your gusset starts and do the same on your sleeve. That leaves you with a gap to attach your gusset in the end. The other method is to attach your gusset first on both parts and then stitch your side seams afterwards. They're both pretty identical and they're both a little bit tricky because they're stitching corners, but they're both fine. The first method of stitching the gusset last means you can try it on and then decide how much of a gusset you need. So that's probably a really good one if you haven't done this style before. The second time around, it doesn't really matter. If you decide to go of stitching the gussets first, all you do is you stitch your gusset to your underarm seam, again stitching only from stitch line to stitch line and stopping there and knotting it. The next step is to fold your gusset diagonally from where you've attached it to your sleeve to the other side, and then if we turn it over, we can then attach the other side of the gusset to our sleeve. And you can see I'm folding it over because that means my seam allowance is on the right side. And then again, I'm going to stitch from stitch line to stitch line. So I'm starting from where my neckline panel is, that seam, and I've of course got the seam allowances either side, and then I'm just stitching to that point in my gusset, which is again the stitching line. What we end up with is the sleeve like that. So you can see I've got a little bit of the underarm seam to stitch, but it should be more or less perfect. I'm slightly out, so I'm going to fix that. But you want to meet at a tip, and then of course if we lay it flat again, we've now got attached two sides of our gusset to our sleeve, and then you repeat the same thing with your bodices. So you stitch it along there again to that point, and then you flip it over and you stitch the other side to your other bodice, again only stitching stitching line to stitching line. Now all we have to do is stitch our underarm on the sleeve and the side on the bodice. If you want to, you can of course finish it as a French seam. If you want to do it, you need to snip where you finished stitching to enable you to do that. So you can see this method, it takes a bit longer because you stitch each side of the gusset separately. However, that means you're not stitching on any corners, and they're really straightforward seams. So a few more starting and stopping, but straightforward seams. The other option, of course, is to insert the gusset afterwards. This method starts off super easy. All you need to do is match up your notches on your side seam and stitch from them down to your hem. Again, at this point, you can make it a French seam or finish each side of the side seam with the overlocker stitch or zigzag. Do the same for the sleeve. Like this. Then all you have to do is insert your gusset the same as before. So you can either stitch each side separately, or you can actually stitch it all in one go. If you stitch all in one go, you just, wherever you reach a corner, you leave your needle in, then you lift up your foot, you move all the fabric to the side, and then you stitch your next corner and you repeat it again and again. That's a really fast way, but I would practice that a few times because you have to stitch perfect corners. Stitching each side separately takes a bit longer, but it means you can line up the corners at your leisure. All done. Let's finish off by talking about finishing. As I said right at the beginning, for a really easy life, you overlock or zigzag each piece individually before you put it together. And that also means, of course, when you alter it or you change your mind, things like that, you can easily change everything. The other option is to finish everything at the end. So if you do that, you can, I would start by overlocking your underarm and one side of the gusset together. Then you go to the next one and you overlock your other underarm and the gusset all the way to the end. I'm going to show you different options for doing it, but you always start with one side of a gusset and the underarm, and then the other side of your gusset, the underarm, because after that you can start where your gusset and your bodice meets, and you go very strangely, you go up, you go all the way around your shoulder, you go down the other side, and then you can continue finishing everything down to the hem. So you do it in one loop. And what I'm going to do is do a fake French seam, where I'm going to basically fold my seam allowance in half, and you can do it on the iron. I'm just going to do it as I stitch. So I'm going to basically end up with a seam allowance like this, so it's folded inwards, and then I'm going to just top stitch 1 mil from the edge, and I can just sort of turn it over as I'm stitching. It's a little bit fiddly, but it gives you a really nice neat edge at the end. And that's it. The blouse is now all ready. Now I made quite a full key vintage inspired one, but I would really love to see your versions as well. So tag me on Instagram, send me a message, or send me an email. I would love to see what you are making. As always, I also love to hear your feedback and questions and comments. Do let me know in the comments below. And finally, of course, I'd love a thumbs up if you found this helpful. And thank you so much for watching.